I don't want to go back and look at the 2020 elections especially, but there's some developments in the news this week that suggest that we might. Remember, the left said that anybody who had doubts about the balloting or the procedures or the change in laws of voting in 2020 was an election denialist, and they always cited kind of conspiracy theorists. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about the fact that in 2020, 158 million people voted. 4 years later, only 155. That's only happened, I think, 2 or 3 times in American history where 4 years later, fewer people voted. But the country grew by 11 million people. So that was kind of odd. So there was changes that we really didn't ponder at the time, and we haven't fully absorbed yet. Hello, this is Victor Davis Hanson for the Daily Signal. I don't want to go back and look at the 2020 elections especially, but there's some developments in the news this week that suggest that we might. Remember, the left said that anybody who had doubts about the balloting or the procedures or the change in laws of voting in 2020 was an election denialist, and they always cited Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood, kind of conspiracy theorists that were saying computers were communicating with China or Venezuela. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about the fact that in 2020, 158 million people voted. 4 years later, only 155. That's only happened, I think, 2 or 3 times in American history where 4 years later, fewer people voted. But the country grew by 11 million people. So that was kind of odd that we went from a 11 million increase in population, but we decreased by 3 million voters. The other thing that was very odd was that traditionally we only had about 40% of people voting before Election Day, either through mail-in balloting or early balloting. And that was very apparent in 2018, when a traditional 35 to 40%, depending on the state, did not vote on Election Day. But given the changes that were democratically inspired, on Election Day in 2020, 70% of the people had already voted, and about 55 to 60% of those, even higher in some states, were Democrats. So there was changes that we really didn't ponder at the time, and we haven't fully absorbed yet. But here's what I'm getting at. This week, a former Pfizer executive who now works for a British pharmaceutical company, GSK, was accused by former employees that had worked for him when he was CEO, or I shouldn't say CEO, in charge of the vaccine program at Pfizer. And their accusation, they took notes during meetings, so it's documented. And even the DOJ under Trump now is looking at it. But here was their narrative, that Pfizer for months had said the results of their early testing of the efficacy and the safety of the Pfizer spike protein anti-COVID vaccine was known. And they were going to announce it sometime between early October and late October. And I remember this. I wrote a column about it. And then something magical happened. There were people on the Pfizer board, allegedly, that put pressure to delay the announcement. And delay the announcement they did. In other words, Donald Trump was saying that we have done something no one else has done. We have given certain concessions, in retrospect, wisely or unwisely, to Moderna and Pfizer. And they, under Operation Warp Speed, we have a vaccine that they claim is 100%. It was not. Guarantee about either being infected or infectious. And they delayed it. Why did they delay it? Because they did not want Donald Trump to be able to say on Election Day, I got the vaccine. They wanted Joe Biden to say after the election, only then did it come. In fact, so profound was that about face that Joe Biden actually said that no one had been vaccinated when he became president. That was a complete lie, because after the election, when Pfizer thought that Donald Trump was safely defeated, they announced it. And then in November, December, and January, 17 million people were vaccinated. So just what am I getting at? There was a lot of very strange things. Remember the Hunter Biden laptop? Anthony Blinken, Mike Morrell, the former CIA director, interim director, they got 51 people right before the October 23rd debate to lie. And they knew it was a lie because the FBI had authenticated the laptop to say that the laptop had all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. And we know from a, albeit conservative poll, Technometrica, that affected 8 out of 10 people who were polled votes. That was a stunning thing to do. And then in addition to that, the FBI was inserting agents into the social media network at Facebook and Twitter, and their job was to censor the news. What Molly Ball in her Time essay said was to suppress disinformation and misinformation. What am I getting at? This week's story about Pfizer sort of confirms what a lot of us said, that the news of the vaccination was deliberately manipulated and delayed so it would not give credit to Donald Trump before the final 30 or 40% of the ballots were cast. And that was a pattern that we saw with the FBI working hand in glove with social media and as well as the government in the guise of Anthony Blinken, who at the time was working for Biden and would be Secretary of State, rounding up ex-government officials, and they were not ex in every case. Some of these 51 authorities were still contractors. Bottom line, the problem wasn't computers sending out signals or fake computer ballot totals. The problem was that we radically changed the voting laws. We denied we did in some ways. We did it for partisan purposes. We manipulated the news. And now we learn that even pharmaceutical companies were massaging the results of their test to hurt Donald Trump's chances in the 2020 election. Thank you very much. This is Victor Davis Hanson for the Daily Signal. Thank you for watching today's podcast. And for more news like that, subscribe to the Daily Signal. And maybe you can check out my own website at victorhanson.com for podcasts, lectures, ultra series behind a paywall, but more importantly, just daily columns that are accessible and free to everyone. Thank you very much.